Hi. So, welcome to this last formal lecture in the political economy of conflict. And here, I sort of want to bring together some tools we've already learned in a way that allows us to think about coordinating, national security policy. So there's a bunch of issues with this. I mean, one, you'll notice that many of the conflicts that we've talked about have this, cross-border flavor, right? So civil conflict, terrorism, it's not like it's localized. At the same time, even when we're thinking about nation states going to war, by definition, that's across borders, right? So, how do you prevent conflict? What are some of the issues? And so, the point I want to make here is that the tools we've used to think about war and peace can be applied in lots of different ways. And one of the ways is in coordinating security policy. And so that's kind of what we'll talk about. Now, this is not the only way to think about coordinating security policy, but I just want to use this as an example of how we can use the tools we've learned to really formulate some of the fundamental issues in thinking about national security. So at this point, hopefully, we all agree that war is bad, and we want to think about how do we prevent it, right? So, one of the biggest problems, of course, with preventing war, as we know, is that people have an incentive to go to war, either to get resources or because they misperceive, outcomes, they make mistakes, or they're afraid that somebody else is going to become more powerful, and so, they can't commit to peace. So, all very different kinds of reasons for going to war, and so the question remains: well, how do we prevent it? And so one of the biggest issues is this idea of free riding, or this idea of policy coordination. So we're going to start with the assumption that if different nations come together as a group, they can agree on peace, and they trade with each other, they do all these wonderful things that we say they should do, and everything is hunky dory, right? In spite of which, as we know by now, we still have war, right? So let's think about this in terms of national defense. And so I'm going to look at it in three different examples. The first one is going to be thinking about this problem through the lens of prisoner's dilemma. How do we formulate this? Well, I'll talk about something called increasing, decreasing, and constant returns to coordinating national security policy. So let's say that we have this possibility of coordinating policy, and that would imply that some of these people are gonna choose to have some good cooperation, and let's call that, in the context of this, high cooperation or high offense, whichever way you want to look at it, and low cooperation. And so there are two countries, high and low. That's country one, and that's country two, right? Now here's the deal. So in this particular case, I'm going to assume constant returns to cooperation. That is, in this case, coordinating on the high strategy. So that's high defense or offense, whichever way you want to look at it. It doesn't quite matter. I mean, if you think that offense is the best form of defense, well, that's high offense. If you just want to do defensive, well, that's defense. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. So what does that mean? This means that if both country one and country two choose to spend money on high defense, they get a payoff of 10. But the cost is 12. That's the individual payoff. But here's the kicker. If both choose high offense, both, mind you, then they get an additional 10. Now, the fact that these two numbers are exactly the same, that's what it means by constant returns to scale, right? That's kind of what the constant returns to cooperation sort of means. So what that means is that overall, if both choose high, then they get a payoff of 20 minus 12, and that's a payoff of 8. Which means if both choose high, they get payoffs of 8 and 8. Got it? But then, let's say one country chooses high. One country chooses high and the other country chooses low. Now, why would they do that? Well, think about the United States and Canada. We have a nuclear umbrella, and quite frankly, that protects Canada, right? So Canada doesn't have to spend money on nuclear weapons, or indeed, it seems like almost any weapons, because they barely have a navy. So those kinds of things, and so what that effectively means then is that for the U.S. then, country one, let's say, they put in this defense cost. So they have continue to have a cost of 10, right? But then, let's kind of move here. They also have a benefit of 10, but that's a net benefit of a minus 2, 10 minus 12, right? Because they don't get this additional benefit of 10, which is the benefit that both the US and Canada would have gotten if Canada had joined, right? So what that means is the payoff here is going to be minus 2. Canada, though, they're going to get a payoff of, let's see, they're going to get a payoff of, they get the payoff of 10 because they benefit from the US's protection, but they don't have any cost. Similarly, down here it's going to be 10 minus 2. And let's assume that if both choose low offense, they're out of luck. So the whole kind of payoff is normalized at 0, 0. Okay? Now, you will notice that this actually, if you kind of play the game here, so if one chooses high, 2 is not going to choose high. They're going to choose low. If one chooses low, 2 is not going to choose high. They're going to choose low because 0 is bigger than minus 2. Ta-da. Well, if that's the case, then clearly, 1 is not going to choose, so basically 2 is always going to choose low. And if 2 always chooses low, so will 1. And so that's not going to be an option. And the Nash equilibrium is going to be that. That's a prisoner's dilemma, right? That's a straight out prisoner's dilemma. Oh, by the way, how do we solve prisoner's dilemmas? Well, remember, solving prisoner's dilemmas requires repeated interaction and patience. That's the whole delta thing. The delta has to be bigger than some number, right? So a solution to this kind of a coordination problem would be really to have a scenario where you have repeated interactions, but the threat of punishment matters, right? So if you have constant returns to cooperation, then punishment, the threat of punishment, is the way to resolve this coordination problem. But that's not always the case, right? Let's say now, let's kind of get rid of all of this. So let's say now, I don't know how I can get rid of that, but the issue is, let's do that, and that. So now let's say that there are increasing returns to coordination. So let's kind of write that down. So you have increasing returns to coordination. What does that mean? This means now you still have a cost of minus 12 from putting up the high defense / offense. However, now the private gain, if only country 1 chose to do the high offense, they would get a benefit of 4. But if country 2 joined, then that would go up by 16. See that? So that's increasing returns to coordination. It jumps from 4 to 16. If you do it by yourself, it's 4. If you coordinate with somebody else, you get an additional 16, which is greater than 4. So it's increasing returns. In the previous case, it was 10 and 10, right? Now, here's the cool thing. There's a reason why these numbers are chosen the way it is. So that still gives you 20 minus 12. And so over here, it's 8 and 8, right? But things are different on this off scenario. Now, the benefit to the country, which chooses a high defense, is basically they get a benefit of 4 minus 12, which is minus 8. So the loss is actually pretty high, right? By the same token, the benefit to the country that doesn't choose defense, choose the low defense, they don't bear the cost, and so they don't bear the cost of 12. They get a straight out 4. So 4 minus 8, and then once again 0, 0 on this end. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's take a look. If country 1 chooses high, country 2 will choose high, so that's not going to be an option. Low, that's not going to be an option. If country 2 chooses high, that's not going to be an option, and that's not going to be an option. What does that mean? Now we have 2 Nash equilibria. Got it? So now we have 2 Nash equilibria. And what this means is the good outcome is possible. How is it possible? Remember why the good outcome might not happen. The good outcome might not happen if one of the players believes that they're likely to be left high and dry and get a minus 8. Why would they believe that? Well, if they don't trust the other person. So in this particular scenario, the way to solve the problem is to have trust. Right? That's the issue. Now, let's move to the third kind of scenario where we have decreasing returns. So let's put that as 1. Darn it. Country 1, country 2, high, low, high, low. Okay? So now there are diminishing returns. Once again, the cost of coordination is still 12, but now the private benefit is 16. So if I choose high and nobody else chooses high, I still get a benefit of 16. But of course, I have a cost of 12. But if the other person also chooses high, then that's a plus 4. So notice that plus 4 is less than 16. So what we have are decreasing returns to coordination. That still gives us 8, by the way. So up here, we still have 8. But now, again, off on the off axis, things are going to be different, right? So now it's going to be 4 and 16, 16 and 4, and if neither one coordinates still 0, 0. So now it's a different scenario. So here, in this particular scenario, we have, if you have high, if one chooses high, 2 will choose low, not that. 2 low, 1 will choose high, 2, not that. And then over here, not that, and not that. So we have 2 Nash equilibria, but these are very different, right? So notice, in this particular case, we kind of don't know what's going to happen. One person is going to choose high, the other person is going to choose low, right? So they're not going to coordinate. So in this situation, we have what are called sometimes mixed strategies. So each person is going to maybe not do a total high or a total low. They'll have a mixed strategy. And, I talk about it a lot more in game theory, but in the game theory class. But that's kind of one of the outcomes, right? So what can we conclude, right? So first of all, if you have constant returns to coordination, then we have a prisoner's dilemma, and here punishment is what kind of brings people to coordinate. If you have increasing returns to coordination, you have the assurance game, which is sort of like the stag hunt that we had talked about. In this particular case, the way to solve it is through trust. And if you have decreasing returns to coordination, it's the chicken game, that kind of last one, yeah, here it's stuff is quite uncertain. Who knows, right? So, what are some practical considerations then? So, basically, what this means is that you want to try and avoid decreasing returns to coordination, right? If coordination doesn't give you enough bang for the buck, people are just not going to do it. That's kind of the basic deal, right? But if you're going to be a leader in trying to get people to get to kind of to coordinate national defense, like NATO, for example, it's really important to build trust between different countries, different leadership, particularly if there are increasing returns to coordination. Yeah? So here's the thing. Remember, in the Soviet era, one might argue that there were increasing returns to coordination. And there, NATO was built on trust. Now, though, with the lessening of the Soviet threat or the Russian threat, it's still there, but not nearly as much. Maybe there's constant returns to coordination. If there are constant returns to coordination, then the only way to get NATO to work would be to punish people who don't pay up into the common, NATO bucket, right? So it sort of depends, what kind of alliance we have and what do we use to build and maintain the alliance might actually change as the context changes. By the way, if we truly believe that, there are decreasing returns to coordination, maybe we live in a kind of world that is like wildly peaceful or something like that, well, then guess what? Things like NATO are going to break up. And so that's kind of so that's sort of one of the insights here, right? And by the way, notice it's a pretty powerful insight. I mean, people talk about NATO, national alliances. If you go to an international studies class, there's entire, classes built around this stuff. But here's a very simple way of thinking about why alliances persist and how they might fall apart. And this is one of the powerful ways in which the tools we've learned can help us understand the world around us. So I just thought I'd leave that as kind of a final kind of idea. By the way, what are some of the things in which we can look at to kind of get this sort of cooperation? Because of course, the wider issue is that the more people cooperate, the less likely they're going to go to war, right? I mean, this is not just about alliance building. And for that, I've assigned a reading for you written by Elinor Ostrom. That's a famous reading. She's famous. She's kind of won the Nobel Prize. And I want you all to read this article, and then there are kind of questions that I want you to think about. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a slightly different format.